Good afternoon, everybody. I know you've been waiting for this much-awaited event, and it is truly our pleasure to start the first Define 09 event of the fall semester with the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists and authors Sheryl WuDunn and Nicholas Kristof discussing their book, Half the Sky, Turning Oppression into Opportunity for Women Worldwide, published by Alfred A. Knopf. What we're going to do, as you know, this is we have an amazing fall lineup for 09, new challenges, new solutions. And this program really builds on the success of Educate 08 and presidential debate at Hofstra to inform and engage the students as well as the community. Now, I know we have limited time, and Sheryl and Nicholas, your accomplishments are so truly inspiring. It's very hard to do justice in introducing you. So I'm just going to mention a few highlights and then give the floor to you. In 1990, Nicholas Kristof, a columnist for the New York Times since 2001, and Sheryl WuDunn won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of China's Tiananmen Square democracy movement. They are the first married couple to win a Pulitzer for journalism. They are also the authors of China Wakes, The Struggle for the Soul of a Rising Power, and Thunder from the East, Portrait of a Rising Asia. They are, I know it sounds odd to say the word, but a really dynamic duo. But I'll begin with, in true gender form, with Sheryl. Sheryl WuDunn is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author who has reported from some of the toughest regimes in the world, from Burma, Myanmar, to North Korea. As a banker, WuDunn has a deep knowledge of finance and global economy. With a background in banking and an MBA from Harvard University, she was a lead correspondent for The Times, covering the Japan crisis that produced lessons for today's economic turmoil. Her longtime coverage of the economic development of China and other emerging markets has given her a broad understanding of and many first-hand examples of how change in centrally planned economies can come and peacefully through growth. Ms. WuDunn also brings a corporate view toward issues and is focused on expanding the concept of work-life, life balance to a circle of life. And I think this is really important when we navigate the public and the private. Financial protection, work-life balance, and giving back. She was the Times' first television anchor for its nightly headlines broadcast, and she developed a 4-hour documentary on China for the Times Discovery Times Channel. She's won other journalism prizes, including the Polk and Overseas Press Club Awards. Sheryl WuDunn graduated from Cornell University, where she's a member of the Board of Trustees. In addition to her MBA, she went to Princeton University, where she got an MPA degree at the Woodrow Wilson School and is currently a member of the Woodrow Wilson Advisory Council. She speaks Chinese and some French and Japanese. It's quite an amazing accomplishment. Nicholas Kristof is a columnist for the New York Times since 2001 and is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner who writes op-ed columns that appear twice a week. Nicholas Kristof graduated from Harvard College, Phi Beta Kappa, and then won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, where he studied law and graduated with first-class honors. After working in France, he caught the travel bug and began backpacking around Africa and Asia, writing to cover his expenses. He studies Arabic. He studied Arabic in Cairo and Chinese in Taipei. Mr. Kristof has lived in 4 continents, reported on 6, and traveled to 140 countries and the countries that we'll call the axis of evil. After joining the New York Times in 1984, he served as a correspondent in Los Angeles and as bureau chief in Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo. In 2000, he covered the presidential campaign, and in particular, Governor George Bush. He was later the associate managing editor of the Times, responsible for Sunday editions. Mr. Kristof has taken a special interest in web journalism. He was the first blogger on the New York Times, New York Times website. He also Twitters and has a Facebook fan page and a channel on YouTube. I don't know how he has the time for all of this. And a documentary about him, Reporter, premiered at the Sundance Festival in 2009 and will be shown on HBO. Haunted by what he has seen in Darfur, Nicholas Kristof has traveled to the region 4 times to provide coverage of the genocide that is unfolding there. In 2006, he won his second Pulitzer Prize for the commentary that focuses attention on genocide Darfur. Together, Sheryl WuDunn and Nicholas Kristof have written Half the Sky, from Oppression to Opportunity for Women Worldwide. This book, which is released today, and today they are here at Hofstra, illuminates the stories of many women who have been severely abused, with a focus on developing countries or the economic South, and also describes how a growing group of social entrepreneurs, primarily local women, are solving the problem and bringing about change. It also shows, and I've had the opportunity to read this book, the ways that all of us here can be actively involved in ensuring women's rights as human rights and truly being partners in bringing about change. Thank you. Sheryl WuDunn.
Thanks so much. It's a delight to be here on day 1 of our book release, so we're delighted to be at Hofstra. And also, I'm also delighted to be here because my son, my oldest son, is looking at colleges. So is this a good place to come? As Maggie said, Half the Sky is about women in the developing world. But it came out today. It's coming out today, but it also is the result of a culmination of many, many years of just what we've seen traveling around the developing world, traipsing through tiny villages and large counties. It started in China. When we were at Tiananmen Square, we obviously were outraged at the killings that we saw in Tiananmen Square of students, anywhere from 400 to 800 students. It was horrific. But in the ensuing years, we also discovered in China, as we roamed the countryside, we discovered that there was something far more insidious, but not as visible. And that was that tens of thousands of Chinese baby girls were missing. And they were missing because they didn't have access to health care, so that they died before age 5, or they were actually the victims of female infanticide, or they were never born because China got the sonogram. And so pregnant mothers were going around to the clinics to see whether or not they were going to have a baby boy or baby girl. And if it was a baby girl, often they got her aborted. So the result was that over the years, 30 million missing girls were missing in China. And that got us thinking, my goodness, were we reporting the wrong story? Clearly, just the way we conducted coverage was awry. There was something wrong about that. So I'd like to talk to you about a story of a girl who really captivated our attention when we were in China. Her name is Dai Manju, and she was 13 years old at the time of the story, and she lived in this remote part of China, in central China, the Dabie Mountains. Oh, yes. And she basically lived 2 hours from the nearest road. Her family, she lived with her parents, an aunt, and a brother, and a pig, all in the same house. They had no radio, no watch, no clock, no electricity, and they were all in this one room. The only piece of furniture in the room was a coffin for the aunt, because she wanted to be prepared, just in case. Well, Dai Manju was in school, elementary school, and by the time she was supposed to enter the 6th grade, her parents thought, well, why should we pay the $13 in school fees, because this girl is going to be cultivating rice in the rice paddies and then coming home to cook the rice at home. What does she need an education for? So they didn't want to pay. They said, you're not going to school. Well, it turns out that Dai Manju was the brightest kid in her class, and the teachers were horrified. And Dai Manju loved school. She would hang out at the school, trying to pick up any tidbits of information that she could, scrounging around for pens and papers whenever she could. And the teachers were just horrified that this girl, this bright young girl, couldn't go to school. Well, we wrote about her in the New York Times, and then all of a sudden, money kept pouring in. $13. A lot of people sent $13 to pay for her school year, right? We got a money transfer for $10,000, and we thought, wow, that's very generous of someone. In any case, we shipped the money off to the school, and the principal was overjoyed. He said, not only can we pay for a Daimanju, we will pay for a new classroom, for a new school. They renovated the school, sent everybody to school, paid for all the kids to get their school books and attend classes. Daimanju not only graduated 6th grade, she graduated elementary school, went on to junior high, she went on to high school, and then she went on to a vocational college in accounting. So we called up the donor of this $10,000 and said, we just want to report back to you, how much you've done for this one school. It goes, oh, well, gee, wasn't that much, And we said, well, you don't understand how much $10,000 makes a difference in a tiny village like that. And there was a silence on the phone. I didn't give $10,000. I gave $100. Well, it turns out that a bank clerk of a bank that is no longer in existence made an error of decimal points and sent along 10,000 instead of 100. So we called up the bank and spoke to the spokesman and said, well, are you really going to come over to Dabia and take the money away from the school? And he said, under the circumstances, we're happy to make a donation. So they did. And so thanks to a bank clerk, there should be a statue of bank clerk in the Dabia Mountains. They educated an entire village. And so Daimanju then got a job in the southern part of China, in Guangdong province, as an accountant for a Taiwanese firm. She got jobs for her friends, also in Guangdong province, doing accounting for other firms. They sent money back to the village. So Daimanju now, her family has a house with electricity, with a TV, with a radio. They have a road to the village. It's transformed. So that's the power of what education can do. And that brings us to why we wrote the book. Basically, the central thesis of the book is that this is the moral challenge facing us in this century. It is how to elevate the rights of women, how to give women rights just to be human beings. And we think in the same way that slavery was the moral challenge of the 19th century, so too now with women and the challenges that they face just to gain basic human rights. In many places, whether it is in Cambodia or India or Pakistan, or in Africa, in the Congo, in Rwanda, in Zimbabwe, throughout the southern part of Africa, women don't have access to health care, so that women will die. They're not even often women yet. Sometimes they are 13, 14, 15-year-old girls who have been raped and then become pregnant and are forced to give birth when their bodies are too immature to give birth, and then they die early. So maternal mortality and rape and sex trafficking, these are issues that afflict women in many parts of the world. And it's been particularly acute for us because we have a soon-to-be teenage daughter, an 11-year-old daughter, and so we understand what it means to have a daughter growing up at that age, and to see what happens to girls like her in some of these countries is just horrific. However, the other central point of the book is that women are not just the victims; they are also part of the solution. The women who have survived a lot of these afflictions, they are the ones who are best able to tell us how to cure these problems and how to come up with solutions to help other women who are in the same situation. And we have just been inspired by some of the stories that we talk about in Half the Sky, by these women who have undergone just horrific treatment and yet emerge wanting to help other women so that they avoid having to go through the same horrific path that they've been through. In many ways, it isn't just that they come up with solutions. These solutions often go beyond the immediacy of one woman trying to come up with a women's shelter. They do involve local authorities, particularly in the case of education. I mean, we think that part of the solution is education, and part of the solution is also empowering women so that they can get jobs and be absorbed into the workforce. And you need both. Education is not a panacea. It goes a long way to helping solve the problem, but is not the answer. And a case in point, several cases in point, are, for instance, in Saudi Arabia and Japan. Women are very well educated there, but they aren't yet absorbed in a meaningful way into the workforce. And we're reminded of a story where Bill Gates was in Saudi Arabia, and he basically was giving a lecture to a room like this, full of men and women, mostly men. Men were on sort of 2/3 of the room, and there was a partition, and then the women were on the other side of the room. And he got a question from a man that said, Saudi Arabia has a goal of being one of the top 10 economies in technology. Do you think we'll get there? And Bill Gates said, frankly, if you're not using half the resources, half the talent in your country, you will never get anywhere near the top 10. So basically, it needs, an economy needs both education of its women and also the absorption of them in the workforce for it to really fully utilize the resources that women can provide. So now I'll turn it over to Nick.
Well, the advantage for you of being the very first stop on our book tour is that you get a first look. The disadvantage is that you're kind of this is the very first time we're doing this PowerPoint, and I was kind of glad that Sheryl was looking in this direction so she wasn't watching how I was fumbling the PowerPoint, but we'll sort it out together. What would a agenda on focusing on women and girls look like? Let me just mention a few of the issues that we think should be very high on that. And one is sex trafficking. And it comes very real to you when you go to Cambodia or to South Asia, India, and see some of these kids inside these brothels. And this is a girl that we just met over the Christmas vacation, in fact. She had been kidnapped at age 13, was locked up in the brothel, and because she was resistant, the brothel owner taught her a lesson by gouging out her eye. And you see this, and this is slavery. And in fact, the number of the peak of the transatlantic slave trade was the 1780s, and there were just under 80,000 slaves a year at that time transported from Africa to the New World, just under 80,000 a year. These days, their estimates vary a good deal, but it's more than 10 times that number, more than 800,000 a year, who are transported into the brothels around the world against their will, by coercion. And you see these people, and it really just burns a hole in your heart. This young woman I met in India, in Hyderabad, she had been kidnapped and sold to a brothel in Delhi. In her time locked up in that brothel, there had been 3 girls who'd been killed, been executed in that brothel. All the girls, there were 80 girls in that brothel. They'd been called out to witness the torture murder of girls who were considered uncooperative, to teach the rest a lesson. Finally, she was brought back, though. And one of the things that is striking, I mean, Sheryl talked about how girls are a huge resource in these countries. When you take girls out of the brothel and you teach them a skill, then they become a part of the economy, they become a part of the solution to these countries. This girl, Abbas Bey, was taught bookmaking at a shelter, bookbinding. And so she's now a good bookbinder. She has a skill. She's earning an income. She's sending her 2 sisters to school, supporting her family. And she's, I mean, I just, you know, this is Abbas Bey now, and she's just such a glorious part of trying to build an economy in Hyderabad in a way that I do find inspiring. There is another side of this as well, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Another element of the agenda has to be maternal mortality. And this is something we don't even think of in this country because basically childbirth and pregnancy are a joyous occasion in this country. Women don't die, with exceptionally rare exceptions. In much of the world, especially those countries where women are not valued, pregnancy is just about the most dangerous thing that can happen to a woman. In the country of Niger, a woman has a 1 in 7 lifetime chance of dying in pregnancy or childbirth. 1 in 7. And for every woman who dies in childbirth, there are about 20 who are injured. And, you know, maybe we'll think, well, this is just kind of nature. It's not. If men had uteruses, there is no doubt, but the paternal mortality would be, you know, high on the agenda. The UN Security Council will be meeting right now to try to resolve it. And it's because the women who die and are injured have 3 strikes against them that they don't get attention. They're poor, they're rural, and they're female. This woman I met in Ethiopia, her name is Mahabuba. Age 13, she in effect had been sold to a man who had raped her. She was pregnant. She gave birth by herself in the bush. Her pelvis wasn't big enough, wasn't fully formed enough, so there was obstructed labor without a midwife, without a doctor. The baby died, and she suffered an injury called a fistula, an obstetric fistula, that left her crippled, that left her leaking wastes and smelling. And so then this man who, in effect, owned her, took her to the edge of the village, put her in a hut, and took away the door so that the hyenas would come at night and kill her. And she was 14 years old at this point. 14. Well, she had a stick, and at night when the hyenas came, she whirled it around her head and fought them off. And then she crawled all the next day to a nearby village where there was a missionary, an American missionary, who she arrived half dead on his doorstep, and he took her to a hospital called the Addis Ababa Fistula Hospital, which some of you may have heard of, may have supported. Has anybody here, by any chance, sent a check or anything to the Addis Ababa Fistula Hospital, the Fistula Foundation? It's a place that very much thrives on support from Americans, run by this extraordinary Australian doctor. And so she had a operation, a $300 operation, that saved her life, and she turned out to be incredibly smart. She's now a nurse there, Mahabuba. And again, part of the solution now. A third element, I think, of any kind of solution is education. Maybe the most transformative investment you can have. And this is an example of that. This is a woman called Beatrice Bira, who is a Ugandan woman near the border of Congo, a backward area. Her parents couldn't afford to send her to school. And then there's a group called Heifer International that moved there. And you guys, I see a lot of heads nodding. Some of you supported Heifer International? Well, you know that their thing is that you send livestock, basically, to give people means of support. So you can send chickens, ducks, fish, goats, calves. And so a church in Niantic, Connecticut, sent some goats to Africa. I think they bought 6 or 7 goats. And one of those goats went to Beatrice's family. And so all of a sudden they had some milk. The goat then gave birth to twins. And so the family had milk to feed them and milk to sell. It had a source of income. And with the income from the goats, they sent Beatrice to school. This is when she began going to school. And she was already several years older than the first graders, but she turned out to be an incredibly bright kid. And she just rocketed through school at the head of her class. And then she became the first in her village to apply to college in the U.S. She was accepted at Middlebury, all kinds of places. She ended up going to Connecticut College on a full scholarship. She graduated a year ago and is now in a master's program. Here's her at graduation day at Connecticut College. And it was a goat that put her through there. I guess what I want to just leave you with before we submit ourselves to Maggie's interrogation here is that you really can be part of the solution. I think there is a tendency for Americans to want to help, but think, aid is going to go to some big, huge bureaucracy. Who knows what's going to happen with it? There's a lot of corruption, and all that is true. Helping people is harder than it looks, but there are two things you can do. One is that I really hope that those of you students will travel abroad to some place in the developing world at some point to expose yourself to a very different life, to a kind of existence that you may not have encountered, and that's, I think, can be part of your education. And it's tough. I mean, if you enjoy yourself every moment of the time, then something isn't working. You want to be over your head, bewildered at times. When I was a student, I went off to Cairo, Egypt, to study Arabic, and things began to fall apart the moment I discovered that Nick is actually, anybody speak Arabic here? Anybody study Arabic? Well, I won't, we're straying into awkward territory here because Nick in Arabic is actually the F word, which made it kind of awkward. And unfortunately, it's not just a obscenity. The conjugation is, it's both the familiar, the kind of the to form, that you're looking down on, you're being condescending when you use it, and it's the imperative. So I clearly had the wrong name to go study Arabic, but that it really was useful in kind of waking me up to the world. And the other thing is that there have been changes in technology that are truly empowering, and we're moving toward a world of foreign policy, a world of foreign aid that is a do-it-yourself, bottom-up, open source world where an individual can go on kiva.org, kiva.org, and make a microloan to somebody for $25. You can go to globalgiving.org, and Abbas Bey, that woman in India who'd been sold to the brothel, learned to be a bookbinder. That project, is supported on globalgiving.org. So anybody can take part in a way that 10 years ago would not have been possible. And in a sense, we wrote Half the Sky in part to be that kind of do-it-yourself toolkit. So thank you very much, and let's turn it into, we'll submit ourselves to this interrogation.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to just start off with a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. First of all, thank you so much. As a sociologist, I have to tell you that in reading your book, I'm always envious about how journalists have the ability to write in ways on key social issues in a very accessible way. And every day I aspire to do that. Having said that, I want to now really talk to you about the idea of globalization. In this age of globalization, what do you think is the kind of shared responsibility? Because as you read the narratives in your book, they're very empowering. And there is this aspect of the individual. But how do you address the idea of a shared responsibility? Because in your book, you also talk about the role of governments and of education. I was wondering whether you could say a few words about that, because I think that's kind of important when so that we think of in most of these places, especially in the spirit of globalization, of governments, corporations, nonprofit organizations, NGOs, and individuals, and how do they all come together?
Well, I mean, ultimately, change comes about when the whole wants to change. So that means, and we've looked at some of the previous movements, I mean, it doesn't come just by passing laws. So it's not as though, one local government passes a law and everything is solved. There has to be a political will, not only by the government, but also by the people. So that means that everyone has to care about these issues to get it on the, nationwide agenda, whether it's in the U.S. or whether it's in a particular country that change needs to be brought about in. And once something is brought on the agenda, then you really can take action that will change the cultural mores, and that's what's really key.
I also wanted to ask if you could speak a little more about the notion of social entrepreneurs. In your book, you give various examples of social entrepreneurs. Could you give a couple of examples of who is a social entrepreneur, and a couple of examples from your book?
Sure. I think it's one of the real differences between the time when we were in college, 5 or 6 years ago, and in that students have always been activists, of course, but traditionally students were activists in the sense of protesting against things. And we'd go around marching and, down with this, down with that. And there are times when that is incredibly important. But there are also times, I think, when one has to start and construct things and support things. And I think that what has characterized a lot of student activism in recent years has been this tendency to start something, some new organization to try to build some effort. And in a sense, that is social entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is typically thought of as starting a business, but a social entrepreneur is trying to fill a social need by starting an organization. And for example, one of the cases we talk about in the book is of a young woman in New Jersey, in the New York metro area, who was just came to think about education in other countries and kids who weren't able to go to school, girls, and so she started a group called Girls Learn International. And the idea was that high school girls in the U.S. could be paired with a school in a developing country and could raise a few $100s over the year to send to that school in a different country. And that spread like wildfire. It's now at a bunch of high schools. They're now probably going to go into the college level as well. And it certainly helped needy high schools abroad. But I think it's also striking that I think it was really eye-opening for those kids in this country who were involved. And that is indeed another reason why I'd encourage you to get involved in these things, that I think it does enable you to see your own life in a new way and maybe makes one appreciate the incredible lottery of birth that we have won by being right here. So that would be one example.
I know there are quite a few, and when you read the book, you're going to read quite a few of the other cases of social entrepreneurship. One of the challenges often, particularly to a Western audience or the audience in the United States and to your readership, as you read this book and in a time where there are already sometimes stereotypes of the global South and how governments and countries and individuals are treated, how do you kind of translate that so there isn't what we call in sociology the othering in ways that can really lead to kind of reinforcing of stereotypes about the people and the governments and the cultures and creating a culture of the other?
Well, I mean, in many ways, on a smaller scale, the issues that we write about in Half the Sky, rape, violence against women, early death, from at childbirth. Not all of those things occur domestically, but some of them do. Rape certainly does. And so there is, people understand what those issues are at home. It's just that they are far worse on a larger scale in the developing world. So we think that there is definitely a challenge out there. But we also write about how it's so important to work on a grassroots level, people to people, so that you get more engaged and so that people find that they can actually have a real impact on a girl's life if they can, help her, buy her school books, for 1 year. And that could be like $5 to $7. You can make a huge difference in the life of that one girl. And so that actually, creates a much more sort of humanizing relationship. Or you could be a pen pal. I mean, there are very simple things that you could do is just keep writing to someone overseas. That'll help their English. I mean, that is, just takes nothing, just the cost of a stamp and a little bit of time to write a letter, but it means so much to that girl overseas or that boy overseas. I mean, we have, talked to many girls who have said, oh my gosh, I was so glad I had this American girl that I could write to. I mean, they are so proud to actually know an American high school kid or college kid. So we think that right now with technology, you can create relationships on a P2P level, a person-to-person level, that really does humanize the entire challenge and not it sort of circumvents this othering process.
I also, before we open up, I have just a couple more questions. One of the things that we hear a lot about is microfinance, and I know you have also corporate background. And can you talk a little more? I know you do in your book about the role that microfinance can play, because we see the side of the oppression, but how it can be made into an opportunity for women and for their families. Do you want to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think certainly education is one prong. The other is economic empowerment. And there's been so much research that really suggests that the dirty little secret of poverty is not so much lack of income, but poor spending. So if you would look at households and how they spend, there actually has been research done to compare the way men who control the purse strings and how they spend, and women who control the purse strings and how they spend. And it turns out that when men control the purse strings, the top three things they spend money on, 20% of their income goes to alcohol, tobacco, and candy. And a little bit to festivals.
Time for us to go off for a beer.
When women control the purse strings, it goes to making sure the kids, are vaccinated, health care, making sure they eat, nutrition, and making sure they go to school, education. So there is a difference in just the spending patterns according to the research. So that's, part of it is women being able to get control of the finances. And it also turns out that when you give them a loan, they're actually pretty good at paying it back and doing something with the money in the meantime. So their micro-lending has really taken off in certain parts of Asia to the point where we've actually, in Half the Sky, we talk about this woman named Saima. She was in some ways, a very typical woman who was just really browbeaten, beaten every day by her husband, who kind of was a deadbeat, couldn't get a job, was kind of unemployable. But the problem with her is that she gave birth to a girl. So her, in-laws were like, what good are you? Can you produce a boy? So she had a second baby, and it turns out it was a girl too. So they were so poor that they couldn't even afford to feed the kids. They shipped off one of the girls to the, to one of the aunts. And she was just, at her wit's end. What is she going to do? Just then, Cash Foundation, a micro-lending organization, happened to be in the village and was talking about micro-lending. And so Saima sort of snuck out and listened and said, they encouraged her, why don't you take this loan and do something with it? What could I do? Well, she, of course, sews and embroiders. So she started a little embroidery business, and it turns out that she was pretty good. The merchants bought her stuff and sold it at the markets, and then they kept asking for more. And she was embroidering as fast as she could, and when she couldn't fulfill their demands, she hired other women in the village to do the embroidery. Pretty soon, she had a really profitable embroidery business. She became the local tycoon. So this woman went from being beaten every day by her husband to the local tycoon. She was paying his bills so that when he got sick, who paid the bills? She did. So it really can be transformative. And if you multiply that on, a wider scale, just think of what it can do for a lot of women.
Well, we have at Hofstra University wonderful programs abroad, but one of the things that you talk about, and I think this is something that's happening in different universities, but one of the issues is that often students go to the global north and not to developing or the economic south. And you write about the fact that perhaps one way to, I think one way to address this is for students to go, but there's always a fear about, litigation, about parents, about university responsibility. And I know we've seriously been trying to change our programs, or rather expand our programs to have students go to the global south, the economic south. And I'm wondering whether, as you mentioned that often it's not as scary as people make it. I thought I would allow you to make a pitch? Here for the expansion of those areas of study.
I mean, it's always funny to talk to students here who are kind of tremblingly asking whether it's safe to go to, wherever, and then you go to wherever, and you talk to people there, and they ask, tremblingly, is it really safe to go to America? And, things always look a little more dangerous from afar, but I think that you get so much reward. It just opens your eyes to new things when you can go and encounter, a different kind of a lifestyle as you do in the developing world and see a different world. We were speaking earlier, and it turns out that Maggie and I know somebody called Urmi Basu in Calcutta. And Urmi runs a shelter in one of the red light districts. And I'd written about her, and so I put in some American students in touch with her, and they went off and kind of interned with her and taught English to the children of the prostitutes that she works with. And there was one woman in particular, we described this in the book, who I made arrangements, helped put in touch with Urmi, and so she went off, and she was teaching English there, and so I emailed her at one point and said, so, how's it going? And she was online right at that moment, so I got back this torrent about, everybody stares at me, and, the food makes me sick, and this and that, and so I was kind of taken aback, and I sort of said, well, do you regret going? And got back this thing, best thing I ever did in my life. And I think there's a lot to that. They do go together. So whether it's going off to work for a summer for Urmi in that place, or wherever it may be, I think one gets a lot out of that. I have a friend who was an aid worker in Darfur, and she was in a really tough area there, and just was incredibly tough, never broke down. She came back here over Christmas, and she was in her grandmother's backyard, and she just broke down utterly, completely weeping. And you know what it was? Her grandmother had a bird feeder, and she thought about it and realized she'd just come from a place where children were dying for lack of food, where militias were running around killing people, and that she, my friend, had this incredible good fortune to grow up in a country where we had such resources that we could help make sure that wild birds don't go hungry in the winter. And she just saw her life in a new perspective, and that's what made her cry like that. So that was an education in itself for her.
Well, thank you so much, and we're going to open it up for questions. We do have about half an hour, and we'd like to try, because this is also especially done for students, to give students a chance to go first before faculty and others. We have two people holding the microphone. We have Lisa Cabrisi and Aisha Hoto. So do come to the microphone before you, or at least have some, put your hand up. All right, we'll start with you.
Well, first I'd like to point out that Kiva in its entirety is one of the most amazing institutions, just because of the essence of how it has its own way of regulating.
You know what? Can you just hold us?
Is it on? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay. I just want to point, just because of the fact that it has that regional institution that will monitor those people so they repay their loans. But what I guess I'm getting to is, how do you think that NGOs are influence in those countries will be when they don't have that regional influence? If it comes off as America or Western influence trying to force itself on those other countries, because of course we don't have, many of the times it'll be us trying to fix the problems in other countries.
And basically, we actually believe you have to work with local partners. I mean, foreign aid is a really tough thing to do. And there's been a lot of criticism of foreign aid, that tends to be top down and sort of the West telling the local countries this is how the aid should be dispersed. And yeah, there are a lot of problems with that. I mean, it's great that the money is allocated for that purpose, but it isn't always implemented or carried out the right way. So we really think that aid can work, and you can always tinker with how best to deploy aid, but it often works the best when it's dispersed in partnership with local groups who know what it's like on the ground, know what measures are going to work, know what people to go through or how to carry out, how to execute. For instance, in micro-lending, it is so important to have local groups of women get together every other week because that gives you peer pressure. If you don't pay back that loan, you have to face your neighbor. How embarrassing is that you didn't pay back the loan? Because everybody knows. It's not just you and a bank. It's you and that circle of women who all know that you couldn't pay back that loan. So, I mean, you can't have the West do that. I mean, the Western banker can't go in there. So it really has to be a mix.
Hey, I was wondering, how do we improve these nations' educational systems without infringing upon their cultural identities and their socio-political institutions?
Sure. That tends not to be so much of an issue, because often one is really focusing on primary education, for example, or and one is typically working with the curriculum that the government already has. One is just trying to get more kids into that school system rather than starting up new schools with one's own curriculum. So it's not so much a matter of starting schools where we bring in, where outsiders bring in a different curriculum. There are a lot of interesting ways that one has figured out to try to get more kids into school, and often they do involve tinkering with culture a little bit. And I think often there's a sense that the way to get more kids in school is just to build schools. And in fact, the most cost-effective ways of getting more kids in school tend to be to use various other combinations to get kids to attend. For example, deworming. We never think about that these days, except maybe for pets. We spend $50 a year to deworm a pet dog. Most of the kids going to school in most of the world have worms, and that causes anemia, it tends to cause sickness, it causes absenteeism. And if you can deworm a child for a year for 50 cents with a pill called albendazole, then that child is substantially less likely to miss school. And so if there was one study in Kenya that suggested that to get an additional kid in school through construction, through brick and mortar, it costs $100. If you do it by deworming, it costs $4. And there are various other efforts by offering school lunches for 11 cents a day per student. And again, there is an advantage in improving nutrition, but the main advantage is it creates an effective bribe to encourage parents to send their kids to school for that free meal. So there are I think we're learning better how to go about improving education systems in other countries and actually getting kids to attend the existing system.
Hello.
All right.
Yeah, I want to emphasize and underline what you say about travel and do it yourself. When my husband and I graduated from college, we went into the Peace Corps in Kenya and stayed very connected to the country. And 9 years ago, when a good friend of ours, who's a university professor, told us he was building an elementary school, we were able to get behind it and here in this country raise money for that school. And many children have been educated. We were able to buy mosquito nets for the bed nets for them to take home. We're getting sanitary napkins for the girls. We read that in the Times, actually, so they don't have to miss school. And that came from us going overseas and doing our own do-it-yourself. I heard you on NPR today, too. Do-it-yourself giving. Hofstra has gotten behind this effort by donating computers to the school. So there's a lot that can come out of just going someplace and seeing the world and seeing where you can make your mark and you can do something. And if you want to read about the school, go to SEMA Academy, SEMA Academy.org.
Thank you. Okay. And then the person.
In looking at the plight of women in the third world, we see... In looking at the plight of women in the third world, we see that two of the most outrageous places, one being Afghanistan, and the other being most recently in Khartoum in Sudan, where a journalist was wearing pants, and at a party with a number of people, they all got lashes. She had the guts to go to court, and so they fined her for $200, and on the other hand, she didn't get any lashes, but she's going to go to jail. She's not going to pay it, so that she could appeal that and so forth. The question is, in dealing with the Taliban, and majority of Americans want us out of there now, how on earth are we going to help women in that environment where they blow up schools and they hit on girls going to school and so forth? How do we deal with that?
This is a particular issue for me in a sense, partly because I think that I'm against sending more troops, more U.S. troops to Afghanistan. And obviously one of the counterpoints, and indeed today's Wall Street Journal has an op-ed by Bret Stephens denouncing me for that, because it makes the point, that, well, what about this other issue? The fact is, Afghanistan's an interesting example because after 9/11, after we went into Afghanistan, we made a difference in the north of the country, in the non-Pashtun areas. We made a substantial difference in Kabul, in major cities like Herat. In rural areas of Afghanistan, we have made remarkably little difference, and especially those in the south and east, in the Pashtun, ethnic Pashtun areas. And I remember a couple of years ago when I was in Afghanistan, I just come across a case of a girl who was 9 years old who had just been handed off to another family. There had been some kind of a dispute between two families, and they have a practice called BOD where you resolve the dispute by handing over a girl in your family to be married to somebody in the enemy's family, and that resolves it. And my daughter was then 9. This girl had been married off, was 9, and I emailed back to tell her and got this sort of indignant letter back from her. You better not ever marry me off. And, just the difference in worldviews. It really struck me. But that practice, very much still goes on today in southern Afghanistan, despite our presence. And at the end of the day, the Taliban is quite unpopular, even in Pashtun areas. But we're quite unpopular too. And in general, the more we go in and try to rat out the Taliban, the more unpopular we are. And in fact, people tend to support the Taliban because they think, well, maybe they have a point about trying to fight these infidels and get them out. So I don't think we're going to bring about any change very quickly. It's going to be a slow, long process. Education of both boys and girls is the best way of bringing about that change. But if the schools that we build are, big ones and say made in America and are organized by us, that's not going to work. But there are some Afghan groups that build schools with real local ownership, and those do work. Greg Mortensen's approach, the 3 cups of tea, that is also very much local ownership, and that works pretty well. There's a woman called Sakina Yaqubi we talk about in the book, an extraordinary Afghan woman who builds schools. And our efforts would go so much farther if we were to support people like Sakina building these kinds of schools around the country rather than having our imprint on everything.
Okay, Rafia? Okay. So, yeah, go ahead and then Rafia.
First, just thank you for bringing so much attention to the situation of women globally. But my question goes to our role as the West, as the United States, in our responsibility for their situation, for their plight. Joseph Stiglitz has written a lot about how, and I remember you did a series several years ago about the financialization of global markets. Money is flowing from the global south to the global north. The amount of aid money that's going down is a trickle, and it's less than the Millennium Development Goal money. We haven't given what we promised to give. Nobody else has either. How do you see the United States' role in all of this?
So, the United States really can be a great role model. And I think that it's taking a step in the right direction. I think the environment is ripe for this. With Secretary Clinton going to the Congo, to Eastern Congo and Goma, how many secretaries of state have been there? When she went to India, she spoke to a group of women. These are really good steps, to start. And I think that we have, she cares about this issue, so she can actually take it farther than it has been in the past. But aid is tough, but I don't think that means you give it up. It means you have to really work hard to make it work. There has been criticism of aid, but that doesn't mean you throw in the towel. It means that you say, okay, if it doesn't work this way, let's figure out how it should work. And as we talked earlier, it really has to be a partnership. You have to work with local organizations in order to affect change. And it's not so much, yes, all right, it is about the amount. The amount is key. There's too little money going to aid, but it also is how can it be most effectively deployed. And that's where you come into the best incentives, and it's not so much the money, as Nick was pointing out. How much does it take to deworm kids? It's much less than it costs to actually create, a huge infrastructure by building a new town or whatever. You need to figure out what is the most effective way to get kids to go to school. So if it means, spending 50 cents to get them to go to eat at lunch at school, and by the way, they're going to be sitting in the classroom and having to learn, their A's and B's and C's or the equivalent, or their 1, 2s, and 3s, that's really an achievement. And if it means iodizing the salt, which is a very cheap way of keeping girls, from losing IQ points, because when the mothers don't have iodine, the kids are born with a lower IQ, and particularly girls are girl fetuses are susceptible to this. It's really pulling the right levers. So if there is a will to actually pursue some of these measures, I think it can go a long way.
We're going to have Rafia and then you after that. Rafia?
I'm from one of the countries you're talking about, from Pakistan, and there's a lot of issue about honor killing and other customs. And she just talked about if the government and the people are willing to work for the social change, then a social change could come. But for my country, I think there are many people who are actually doing the honor killings and stuff. They don't want the change. They want it like that. So how do you deal with that?
One of the people who is my hero in Pakistan, who we write about, is Mukhtar Mai in the South Punjab in Pakistan. And it's been fascinating because she really has brought about real changes in her area. This is a woman who, in 2002, because of a family dispute between her family and a higher caste family, she was sentenced by a village tribunal to be gang raped, and she was. And these kinds of gang rapes were very common in the area by those with power because there was essentially no disincentive. What would happen in each case was the woman, after being raped, would commit suicide, and there would never be a prosecution. And so Mukhtar, indeed, prepared to commit suicide. And just in the nearby village, a month before the same thing had happened, the girl had drunk a thing of pesticide and killed herself. But her family, told her not to, and the local imam at the mosque told her not to, that she had done nothing wrong. And as time went on, she began to feel not only humiliated, but also furious at these men, her neighbors, who had raped her. And so she prosecuted her attackers. And she then used compensation money to start a school in her village. And she's just the most extraordinary woman. She's then since used money that people have sent, including a lot of my readers, to start a women's shelter there, to start other schools, to start a 24-hour phone hotline, to start a kind of emergency rescue squad that rushes out when they get a phone call. And as a result, there are a lot of other women in that area who now have a role model, and when they are raped, and then instead of killing themselves, they go to Mukhtar, and she helps prosecute. And so now, all of a sudden, there is a real incentive. The incentive structure has changed, and there is a risk if you go out and rape some girl, even if you are moderately powerful and she is some uneducated peasant. And as a result, the number of rapes in that part of the South Punjab has come down very, very dramatically. So you do see change. You really do see change. And I think education is the best road to that. I think Pakistan and Bangladesh are an interesting contrast in that regard because, in 1971, when Pakistan and Bangladesh split, who would have thought Bangladesh seemed utterly hopeless? And one of the differences was that Bangladesh really emphasized education of girls in a way that Pakistan did not. These days, in high school in Bangladesh, there are more girls than boys, which is quite extraordinary. And that paved the way for Bangladesh to develop a real garment industry, because these high school educated girls then ended up working in the garment factories, which supported it. Then you began to have a huge NGO mission with several wonderful NGOs, including Grameen, but also including BRAC, which is the largest development organization in the world. And all this has really had a transformative effect on Bangladesh and created a level of stability. So, it's not hopeless. Change can come. It just tends to come one step at a time.
And I think the West can really help in the sense that, supporting education. Obviously, you don't want, in the case of Afghanistan, you don't want the Taliban educated school. You don't want to support those. You want to support just general education that will teach them how to read and write and sort of fend for themselves. At the same time, you also want to support role models in what we call social entrepreneurs. You want to find the Mukhtars of the world. She's an extraordinary woman, but there are lots of extraordinary women at the local level too that you can support, that the West can help support, because they're the ones bringing about change, such that you begin to nurture an ecosystem that is self-supporting.
Thank you.
Sorry, my apologies.
No problem. Students first. I've heard your message and look forward to reading more in your book about the on-the-ground solutions and the social entrepreneurism. My question has to do with some efforts to do some very consolidated, organized giving. For example, I've been very involved in corporate America financial services, women trying to identify issues and give back and figure out a coherent and cohesive way to do it. One of the things these women notice in at least America is that there's a lot of splintering of efforts. It seems like there's a women's organization for just about every moment of one's day in life. And the concern, I wonder if you see a similar concern globally. And so that's one part of my question. The other is whether the following is misguided. And that is, of course, we're all looking for the silver bullet and looking for a solution. And one of the things that these women were focusing on, perhaps it's very Western, is that you're not really going to make a change unless you're in the power structure. So that, how are you going to get women into positions of power in their village, whatever that might be. So there was a focus on finding organizations that did work along those lines, and lastly, in order to have power over the very men, people, whatever, that are persecuting them, and how do you overcome that? So those were the focuses of this particular initiative and this particular financial services institution, and I wondered if you saw this as an issue, the splintering issue.
Yeah, no, look, we list 45 to 50 organizations in the back of our book. There are a lot of organizations, but in many ways there's not enough to help the world. And they each have their stake, which is fine because that's the way the world is. Each individual has to find what works for them. It's not as though there is a hierarchy of solutions or a hierarchy of ways to cure the world. We need them all. And I think the best way to approach this is what works for you, because ultimately what will be most effective is if you care about an issue that you want to devote your time, your effort, and your resources to. So it has to be an issue that you care about and develop a passion for. So it doesn't matter that one institution says, oh, the key to solving the world is that women have to be in power. That's the key for them, but it isn't the key, because you can help a girl go to school. She's not going to be in power, but she'll be powerful over herself if she has textbooks. If she, in some cases, she doesn't have a bicycle to school, because otherwise she's a 2-hour walk away from school. Things like that, and it really comes down to what you feel comfortable devoting your time and effort to. And it's great that there's an organization for you who will fit the bill. But I do think at times the splintering, as long as it's not at cross purposes, then there's room for everyone, because there's just so much that needs to be done.
Can I just add something? We're focused on this partly because there are a bunch of Half the Sky book clubs, and we'd really like to get them, after they've read the book, to become, activist circles in some form, and figure out what they can do. We have started a website called halftheskymovement.org that does list a bunch of organizations in this space to try to be one step toward engagement and activism. And the other thing I just wanted to mention, you talked about dealing with the men in these kinds of situations, and let me just sort of address it, because I think there's often a subtext here that men are jerks in a sense. That partly because of the research that Sheryl mentioned earlier, that men tend to spend money on beer and prostitution and cigarettes, while the women spend money on their children, and partly because in so many of these countries you do have problems of rape, of wife beating, of so many other things, often at the hands of men, that it's, I think, easy to see the problem as basically men in these countries. And I actually think that's untrue, that the problem is in many ways a patriarchal culture, but women are very much a part of the problem too. They absorb these values, they transmit them. The people who cut their daughters' genitals are women. The people who run brothels, who traffic in girls, are women. If you ask people in a variety of countries, do you approve of wife beating, then there is a difference between male and female responses. Men are typically about 10 percentage points more likely to approve of wife beating. But the best predictor of whether you believe in wife beating isn't whether you're a man or a woman, is whether you live in a city or a rural area. If you live in a city, you probably think it's a bad idea. If you live in a rural area, you probably think it's a good idea, male or female. And so, in India, girls age 1 to 5 are 50% more likely to die than boys that same age. And one of the main reasons is that mothers are only half as likely to take their own daughters to be vaccinated as their sons. And so I think it's way too simplistic to think of the problem just being men. And the problem is really this culture and how one changes it. And for that, education may be the best single solvent of these kinds of attitudes that we have.
I just want to be sure that I don't miss any students first. And we have just 5 minutes, so okay.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you, and also to challenge you, as a member of the journalism, I think the media has been very remiss in advertising many of these things. I read your columns, I saw the article in the Times. How do you change a society like Saudi Arabia that you mentioned, where there are very large numbers of educated people, very high unemployment, a very, what we consider backward, or I consider backward social structure? This is so prevalent. I mean, yes, the Grameen banks and all of these things are wonderful, but I really feel that the media has been terribly remiss, possibly because the media, the Times and every other newspaper and magazine, are dependent, they're a business, and they are dependent on advertising. And I challenge you two, who have achieved certain level of fame and power, to do something about the media in this country, both domestic and foreign. I mean, the news is just whatever. It's a challenge, really, to try and do something about the media, to advertise and make known. The New York Times or the Washington Post, if you have looked at newspapers in outside of the major metropolitan areas, I happen to be familiar with some because we live some, whatever, and all there is definitely local news, and it's just, I mean, people are so ignorant, it's just incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I balk a little bit at single-handedly accepting responsibility for turning around America's news media. But let me make a couple of points. First of all, what we in the news media tend to do best is cover what happened yesterday. What we tend to do worst is cover what happens every day. And these are the kinds of issues that tend to fade in the backdrop. They don't get covered because they're always happening. They're never announced. They're just there. And it's an issue we wrestle a little bit in the book. But issues like public health, for example, are just classic things that we do a particularly bad job of covering. I don't think that it has to do with, as to the lack of coverage of international news, I don't think it has to do with advertising. I think it has to do with a couple of factors. One is that people aren't hugely interested in these kinds of things. And second, they're expensive and sometimes dangerous to cover. I mean, I remember when Anderson Cooper went off to Eastern Congo, and it was a huge effort for CNN, and there are real risks in going off to Eastern Congo. More than 5 million people have died there. 5.4 million people have died there. The most lethal conflict since World War II. I mean, Anderson should have been there. He was right to go. But his ratings for those episodes where he was in Eastern Congo, his ratings fell the lesson, if you're running CNN, is going to be, don't do that. Rather have a Democrat and a Republican in a studio together yelling at each other. And that's entertaining and will get people to watch. The final thing is, if you think it's bad now, I'm afraid, just wait. The cost pressures on all the news media are such that it becomes harder and harder to cover things that are a long way away, that are expensive, that may be dangerous, and there are going to be fewer news organizations around, I fear, in a few years. For people who want to go find what is happening, it's never been easier. But if you are not actively trying to seek out that news, you won't come across it by serendipity the way you would in the past.
But there actually is, there is hope because, I think the news media cover what is on the national agenda. And if enough people care about this issue, if enough people spread the word, if enough people say this, this is the moral challenge of our time and we won't stand for it, then it will get on the national agenda. The news media will cover it, and then they'll just be piling on it. So, that's, what brought about changes in slavery. It was not because, one or two congressmen said, we're going to fight this thing. It's because the, people, at large, they fought for it. They said this is intolerable. And that's what has to happen. The country itself, the people who inhabit the country have to say this is just intolerable.
We have one last question from Andrea, and I just want one question that I'll end with, and I think that's it for today.
This doesn't end up being a downward question, but when I read your pieces in the Times and then the whole magazine issue, and I see $2, a woman gets the seed and then doesn't get beaten anymore, changes her life. I know what I'm kind of supposed to think is $2, that's easy, $2 easy, you can make changes. I kind of read that and see the opposite and say, $2 is all it takes and we're not solving this? $1 for mosquito netting, these kind of little amounts that people, it's not just that, but I don't see it just that people are doing it. I get depressed when I look at these polls about foreign aid, and I see that Americans don't want to give foreign aid and think our foreign aid giving is 10%, and it's tiny what we give for foreign aid. And so I think I'm a lot less optimistic in looking at Americans who might send a buck here, a buck there, but have no idea what the foreign aid budget is and think America's doing a lot. So I wonder about your thoughts more in kind of an Uber way of how well we're doing as a nation in addressing these problems.
I think that the politics of foreign aid have changed in an important way in the last decade. Traditionally, foreign aid was something that liberals on the coasts worried about, the hand-wringers on the coast. And what really has changed is that now there is an important constituency among conservatives and evangelical conservatives in particular in the middle of the country. And that is hugely important in changing the politics of aid. If you look at President Bush, who those of you who read my column know that I'm hardly his biggest fan, I think his best accomplishments and a truly important legacy, they were precisely in this area. One was PEPFAR, his AIDS initiative, which is a terrific thing. It's a wonderful thing. And everybody talks about it as his greatest legacy. And he knows that. And I think that other presidents will see that this is something that they can get credit for from left and right. And a second was his malaria initiative, which was a much smaller scale, but similar. And a third was his efforts, which really did make a difference on sex trafficking. So you get people like Rick Warren, for example, who have genuinely done good work on these issues. Sam Brownback is maybe one of the most conservative members of the Senate, but has worked with people at the very liberal end to focus on issues like malaria, trafficking. The politics of foreign aid now are very interesting, utterly confusing, but there does seem to be potentially a chance for a broader bipartisan coalition that will generate support because of what Sheryl talked about earlier, that this is something that people do seem to care about.
And if congressmen and women sense that their constituents in their home district care about foreign aid, they're going to, say, oh, it's on the radar. If they don't sense anyone cares, if no one writes them a letter saying, this is an important issue, then, they won't know that people may or may not care. I mean, it won't be an issue for them. But, again, it comes back to, there has to be, people have to care about this issue. And then I think that's the beginning of change.
I want to, as a teacher and as an action researcher in the area of violence against women, I want to end with the last question, and I'm taking the prerogative as being the moderator today. One of the issues that you talk about, and I think is really key when we're talking about a time of a lot of wars and ethnic conflicts, the role of women in wars, and while we know that the number of men and boys dying is much higher, rape as a huge issue in terms of wars. And I was waiting to think in case it came from the audience, but you talk about in your work, and I was wondering whether you could just say a little bit about how the connectivity between violence against women and war.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, women are, terrible victims in war, but, the men are the ones who often die. So, it's always, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, you can't still support the problem that women face, in times of conflict. But it's also often after the wars, that the women, are still, not helped. I mean, people say what is sad it is that all these men have died, but then they forget that the women who survive have these lasting impacts in the same way that war veterans have, and so that they do need to be taken care of in that sense. Is that addressing it?
I just wanted to, I think it's such a major issue these days, and how do we, we also have to address the issue of men who are getting killed in war, but also how rape is increasingly used as a source of power,
Yes.
honor,
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
and all
Right,
the issues
right.
that you
No,
discussed.
I mean, rape basically is a tool of war. I mean, they, in many places, in Sudan and in a number of these places, it's a tool of war because it's cleaner. It doesn't leave bodies. And in fact, it leaves very few traces that will come back to attack them because the victims often are so intimidated and terrorized that they don't report it to the local authorities. So, you do end up terrorizing a population, which is the impact that you want to have when you're in war. But at the same time, you don't have, the bodies that are left there as, as evidence of your pillage. So that's why it has become a tool of war, very sadly so.
Well, thank you so much. A big hand. Thank you. I just want to take a very quick moment to thank President Stuart Rabinowitz for being here and for playing a key role in getting Define 09. Okay, and you're welcome to come to the club. We have a little time with Sheryl and Nicholas, so please do come. And I just want to take a quick moment to thank the organizers. It's a great series of events we have set up. And thank you, Katie and Melissa Connolly, she's here. And thank you to Rosanna and Mina.